Well, today we're wrapping up the story of Samson, talking about one of the most epic stories of anybody in the Old Testament.
It wraps up in such an incredible way. And what we learn is that every situation can be salvaged if you're willing to give it to God. So that's what we're talking about on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Jeff.
Yes.
I had a thought just now.
Okay.
And I was thinking about what I was going to ask you, something personal, right? So it's just to help our listeners to connect. And so I thought about this. What is one of your guilty pleasure foods? Like, the food that you say, I shouldn't eat this, but I love it too much.
Yeah. French fries.
That's it?
French fries. That's my thing.
Yeah.
Fried anything is my guilty pleasure, and I have to stop. So, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bottom line is it is different for everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Like my brother's is ramen noodles. I don't know why.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
he gets like a month's worth of sodium in one meal.
Right.
Yeah,
but it usually for most people involves carbs.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's fries. I love fries. Yeah. I don't know why.
And speaking of people who have great physiques,
yes.
we're wrapping it up.
Yeah, me and all my French fry friends remind you of Samson. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, mm-hmm, Samson is
with the gouged out eyes.
Well, today, if you didn't tune in yesterday, today we're talking about Samson at the end of his life, and he's one of the greatest judges in the history for Israel, and he is kind of like the strongest avenger.
Yeah,
he is just the guy who's endowed with superpowers. But last week he confessed his truth to Delilah. He was betrayed, and they gouged his eyes out, and now he finds himself, at the end of his life, really.
Yeah. So the Bible says, but not long after this, his hair began to grow back.
That's great.
Right? So here's what it says. We're going to start in Judges 16, and I'll start in verse 23 in the New Living Translation. It says, the Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemies to us, and the one who killed so many of us is now in our power. Half drunk by now, the people demanded, bring out Samson so he can amuse us. And so he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. And Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them. And now the temple was completely filled with people, and the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, sovereign Lord, remember me again. O God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistine for the loss of my two eyes. And then Samson put his hands on the two center pillars that held up the temple, and pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, let me die with the Philistines. And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people, and so he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Later, his brothers and other relatives went down to get his body, and they took him back home and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, where his father Manoah was buried. Samson had judged Israel for 20 years.
Yeah. So a couple of different judges in the history of, the book of Judges, they only get mentioned by a verse or two.
Yeah.
Samson is given several chapters.
Oh, yeah.
And nowhere do we see a more epic ending. And so this has the makings of every Hollywood movie ending.
Right.
That I've ever seen outside of like the New Testament and the resurrection of Jesus.
Every kind of Hollywood revenge movie.
Yes.
Yeah, right, where the hero is willing to die in order to bring justice to his enemies or whatever,
Or maybe he perhaps finally goes noble, right? Finally knows what it means to, be a part of something that's selfless. Well,
I think this is the first time we hear him pray.
Oh, yeah. We don't know if he ever really did pray, but it's the first time it's recorded.
This is the first time it's recorded.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So he says, put me between the two pillars and that hold up. And so we have to remember, he's blind.
Right.
And so his hair had begun to grow back. So let's talk about the significance of that one verse. Why would God include that at the very beginning when it says his hair had already begun to grow back?
Well, yesterday we mentioned that, he wasn't powerful because of his hair. He was powerful because of what his long hair represented, and that was surrender to God, a mission, a calling that God had on his life. And the hair represented that because he was obeying God, not cutting it. And so then when his hair got cut, it represented the fact that he had abandoned his commitment to God.
Yeah.
So then when the hair started growing back, you also see the next words out of his mouth is between him and God, praying, saying, you're sovereign, not me. He finally recognizes God's in control. This one is not, earlier, oh, I'm so thirsty. Look what all I've done for you. I'm going to name this miracle after myself. Now he's saying, God, you're the sovereign God. I realize I haven't been doing this in my own power. And that's really what the hair represented, was he wasn't his own. He was God's.
So,
and he finally figured that out.
Right. And before we even move on from that, let's talk about the fact that, like so many of us in our lives, we have to hit rock bottom before we realize those things.
Yeah.
And so rock bottom is a term that's very common among like 12-step programs and AA and things like that. So to bottom out is to get to the lowest point of your life to where you're saying, like, I can no longer do this by myself.
Yeah.
I don't have the will or the strength. And so Samson, in a lot of ways, recognizes that, even though I was all about myself, before, I realized that I'm nothing without God.
Yeah. Well, this sounds weird, but you have to remember that God's kingdom, God's economy is almost completely upside down from the way that our natural minds would think it. If you hit bottom, you were running from God, you were doing your own thing, and you hit bottom, and that got your attention, you turned to God. One of the greatest things that's ever happened to your life is that you hit bottom, right? And this is what happens with Samson. This is the only time we hear him say, you are sovereign, not me, that you're in control, not me. The greatest thing that can happen to you is when you come to your senses and you realize God's God, not me. And that's where real freedom comes. So he certainly wasn't afraid to die. He was a powerful man, a brave man. He wasn't afraid to die. What he realized was how much he needed God.
Yeah, so imagine if you were, it's hard to, but imagine if you were Samson and, your eyes were taken from you, which is very painful, obviously. And then you're thrown in captivity. And then in order for a person's hair to grow back, it had to have been a considerable amount of time.
Oh, yeah, a long time.
Which means that he was in captivity for a long time. And so, knowing that he continued to honor God by keeping his vows as he did as a child, like not letting his hair be cut, it sort of is left, we're left to imagine all the things that he was thinking and praying through and going through while in captivity. It sort of reminds me of Paul, the Apostle Paul, when he was on his road to Damascus, and then Jesus appears, and it says that he went into the city and he was blind for 3 days, and he neither slept nor ate or drank, and he just laid there. And the only thing that he was left, and it doesn't say so, but we're left to sort of imagine what did he feel?
Right.
And Paul was probably thinking, I can't believe I've been persecuting Christians.
Right.
And he's left with this anguish. Well, again, it doesn't talk about Samson's captivity and, moments, but he had to have, just sort of reflected on his life and probably realized all the things that we're talking about thousands of years later. Yeah. Which is like wrapped up in your own selfishness, cockiness, trusting in yourself versus confidence, trusting in God. All these different things he had to, been thinking about. So by the time he does get brought up out of prison or from his captivity, he's like, I'm ready. God, if you'll just allow me to be a part of your mission one last time, I'm ready to give my life finally for this mission.
I think that when you look at this event, I don't personally think this was the only time this happened to him. So they didn't want to kill him, right? They just gouged out his eyes, kept him inert. They thought, oh, we'll have him work like a donkey, that kind of thing. But why would they say bring him out so he can entertain us? Because
they were drunk.
Yes, but
it does say that
he's a pretty charming guy. The ladies love him, right? The whole thing that kicked off all his fights against the Philistines was he told a joke, right? I think God uses the gifts that you have and the talents that you have for his glory. So when I think about it, he's walking around in a circle, he's grinding meal or he's grinding corn, he's whatever. I think he's probably thinking this through. I think they've brought him out before to mock him. Hey, have Samson play the clown. Hey, have him bend these metal things. Have him, right, whatever. And they just didn't believe that the Spirit of God would come back on him again. They cut his hair and then they let it grow. I don't know why they would, but they let his hair grow. And I wonder if they hadn't brought him out before and said, let him amuse us. And then him being pretty savvy and being entertaining, he's out there doing his thing. And then he says to the boy who's leading him along, hey, take me over by those pillars. He'd been there before. So he knows, okay, this is the most strategic spot to be. I think he just played along until he could get where he needed to go. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if we get to heaven and find out he'd been thinking about that for months. That, okay, I'll do my dance, I'll entertain you, and when God's Spirit comes back on me, I know exactly what I'm going to do. Because it's a weird phrase that they say, have him come out and entertain us. It's almost like he'd done it before. So do it again. Bring him out and do it again. And like you said, they're drunk, so they're not anticipating something bad happening.
Right. And, again, it's just one of those things where they're experiencing a little bit of cockiness themselves because they've demonstrated their power over Samson, right? They've obviously taken out his eyes. They probably, tortured him and beat him, whipped him. I don't know. But the bottom line is they're thinking there's no way that he's going to overtake them because they've already, he's revealed the secret. They did it. Yeah. He's done.
And they're worshiping their God.
Yeah.
They feel like their God had delivered Samson into their hands. Look at this is the mighty, warrior, and our God gave to us. And that's when God goes, oh no.
Right.
Right. So Samson prays, and his prayer is in direct alignment with God's will. And that's when we see great things happen, right?
That's right.
So this is why Jesus taught us to pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What I'm saying is I want my prayers to be aligning with your will because that's when, miracles happen. So God takes the victory away from these people. And it says that 3,000 people died that day. At least 3,000. There are 3,000 people on the upper floor, so we don't know total how many. But it said more people died in that one event than had died in all of his ministry prior, right? And all the battles that he'd had before. And this is why I think when we started off earlier, this is why we say it's such unfulfilled potential. This guy never lost a battle. This guy never had a close fight. This guy literally lived among his enemies and never had a close fight. If it hadn't been for the women, he would have kept going, right? He probably would have kept doing these things. But his pride took over, his lust took over, and he gave in. And he only served for 20 years. Can you imagine if he'd served for 40 years? Like some of these other guys did? He wouldn't have just started to deliver the people, which is what the promise was, because God knew what was going to happen in his life. He wouldn't have just started to deliver. He would have delivered them. Nobody could stand in his way. Dude, when one guy steps up and takes the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000, why wasn't he doing that every day? Right? It'd take him less than a year. He just solved this whole problem. And then once he's done in that area, he just moved to the next tribe and get rid of the Moabites and go over there and get rid of the Amalekites. He could have done it all. And he just didn't do any of it because he did not realize until too late that his powers weren't for him. His power was supposed to be for God. And he used it for himself.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you've ever, prayed a certain way, and really you have like what John Orper calls like a shadow mission.
Oh, absolutely.
Have you ever done that?
Yep.
So the definition of a shadow mission is like you sort of like disguise it under the umbrella of something noble, but really it's selfish underneath.
Yeah.
And so, and I've done this at times. It's like saying like, God, help me to win the lottery to get $100 million so that I can serve you.
Yes.
Right? And it's like, that is so noble. I just want to give most of / some of it away, and it's like, so it seems noble, but it's a shadow mission.
God, I will give away 80% of that $100 million you give me.
Right. Right. And so it's like, and that's obviously,
I'll struggle along on that other 20 mil.
Right. That's a ludicrous example, but it is true. Sometimes what we do is we pray, and we pray with the wrong motive. And, and it's just, in the book of James talks about that too. And so we don't get what we ask for because we're asking wrong. And so I think that, the idea that you mentioned before, that Samson prayed something that perfectly aligned with God's will, and nothing was in it for him.
Right.
Nothing.
Right.
In fact, it's the opposite. He got to the point where he said, I believe in this so much, and I deserve what I'm going to get. Just let it end for me. Perhaps he thought to himself, like, I'd rather do this and go out and, like a warrior.
Yeah.
Just like a warrior in that day.
The only thing that was in it for him was, with this one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes. So he's looking for justice.
That is true.
At that point. So there's a little bit of justice there, but God brings justice. That's not a wrong thing.
Right.
Right? So instead of revenge, which was the cycle that he had before, thinking that he deserved to execute judgment every time somebody offended him, now what he's saying is, if you help me, give me justice for these eyes. That's different than a revenge cycle, where he's recognizing that God's the one that does this, not him. And that's at the core of forgiveness, quite honestly. I've had conversations with a lot of people lately about forgiveness, feeling like forgiveness is when we go to the offender, it's okay. And it's not okay. What they did is not okay. Forgiveness is just me choosing to say, I no longer I'm going to give up my right to think of myself as the executioner. Right? You're the judge, you do it. And this is the first time we see him say, God, if you'll do it, I'd like payback for my eyes, but you're the only one that can do it. You're the sovereign God. So he wasn't relying on his own strength at that point. He was just trusting that God would give him justice. There's a big difference between revenge and justice. So
growing up, attending like the traditional Baptist, churches that you and I grew up in, almost the same background.
Right.
Did you go to a thing called Sunday school, and did they have felt?
Yes.
And was Samson not your favorite story?
Oh, absolutely, man. He's got chains on. He's got huge muscles. He usually had big brass bracelets and stuff. Yeah. Tough guy.
Yeah, so those of you who don't know what a felt board is they would have just a board of felt, and these things would stick to felt. And they would literally put
pictures. They'd be pictures.
They'd be pictures for kids. And I can't even tell you the number of times that, I've heard stories from the Old Testament. And David and Goliath and Samson were two of my favorites.
Yep. They're just amazing. So this is Samson's story. I mean, we're basically wrapping it up. What I can say is I think the biggest lesson to learn is that Samson did not choose to be captured. Samson did not choose to be humiliated. But the choices he did make led to the consequences he got, right? He did choose to hang out in Philistine territory when he shouldn't have been. He did choose not to engage the enemy in battle. Instead, he engaged the enemy in bed, right? He chose to live in sin with Delilah. He did choose to brag about the secret of his strength. And while he wasn't paying attention, he soon discovered when it was too late that he couldn't escape the consequences of his decisions. So his decisions led to these consequences, but in spite of his past, in spite of his bad decisions, God still loved him. And this is the amazing thing, is we feel like there's a point where we cross a line and God doesn't love us, God doesn't care, he gave up on us. And there's never a moment God gives up on us. God heard his prayers, and God answered his prayers, and he brought a great victory to Israel.
Yeah, and another final thought is this, that it's never too late to turn back to God.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how long you've been running, how long you've been denying, ignoring, blaspheming. It doesn't matter how long you've been running from God. Even at the end of your life, if you think there's no way God can use me, right? You could turn the name of Scrooge around, right?
Right.
You could be a person who is known for the good things. And even at the end of your life, you could be a person who repents and turns around, and you could accomplish even great things at the very end. So here's Samson turning to God in the last moments, literally.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in the temple when he prays.
Yeah.
And then moments later, we're to assume that it comes down and he dies. So after everything that he had done wrong, he goes to God, and what does God do? God responds. Just to let our listeners know, man, for all the wrong things that we do for so long in some cases, it's never too late, because you're a prayer away from God's forgiveness, God's blessing, God's empowerment, and most of all, God's love.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to end for you when you come back to God like it ended for Samson.
That's right.
Right? I kind of wish Samson had said, God, give me the ability to to fight with your senses and fight them that way. Instead, he went down that way because that's the way he chose to go. But I don't think it has to be that way for us. What I do think we can learn is that if God could still work in Samson after all the mess he'd made out of his life and the wasted potential, he can certainly make something worthwhile out of our lives. And it doesn't have to be the end. This could be the very beginning. After you bounced off the bottom, this could be your rebound that God says, okay, now you really know it's me that's giving you power, and I'll do it day after day after day after day after day.
That's great.
Yeah.
So thank you for that brand new thought. Now I got in my mind that Samson could have prayed and said, God, give me bat radar.
Wouldn't
and then
have been cool.
He would have had super strength and bat radar.
Yeah.
That's even a better superhero.
I know.
Yeah, but thanks for that. Throwing that in my brain.
There's a little bit of like he gave up there a little bit rather than trying to figure out some other thing. But it is what it is. I think that we don't have to give up. And that's what grace does. That's what the cross has done for us, is we've all come to the point where we realize we're sinners and our only hope is Jesus.
That's awesome. Well, hey, guys, we'll see you next week as we dive into, continue on with the book of Judges.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.